Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the True Scary Stories compilation. Story 1. The Unsettling Corner. It started with Rusty, my loyal golden retriever, barking at the corner of my bedroom every night. At first, I dismissed it as one of those strange dog behaviors, a quirk, something he'd soon grow out of. But as the weeks dragged on, his relentless barking grew more frantic, more desperate. His eyes would fixate on that same spot, wide with a terror I had never seen before. "Rusty, what's wrong, boy?" I'd whisper, but he would only whine and glance back at the corner, his tail tucked between his legs. It was unnerving. The corner, to me, looked like any other part of my small, cramped room. Yet, Rusty's reaction was anything but ordinary. One night, curiosity gnawed at me. What was it about that corner? Why did it inspire such dread in Rusty? I decided to set up my camera, a simple device I used for vlogging, to record throughout the night. Maybe, just maybe, it would capture whatever was causing Rusty's distress. That night, Rusty's barking was more frantic than ever. His howls pierced through the silence of the house, sending chills down my spine. I lay in bed, heart pounding, unable to sleep. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off into a restless slumber. The next morning, I eagerly retrieved the camera. As I watched the footage, a sense of dread filled my stomach. The night vision revealed Rusty barking incessantly at the corner, just as he had every night. But this time, there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible movement. My breath caught in my throat. I rewound the tape, my eyes glued to the screen. There, in the shadows of the corner, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and thin, with a sinister smile etched on his pale face. He stood there, motionless, watching Rusty. Watching me. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into my soul through the screen. My hands trembled as I paused the video. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of glitch, a trick of the light. But the terror in Rusty's eyes told me otherwise. Something was in my room, something that only Rusty could see. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to confront the presence directly. That night, I sat in bed, camera in hand, pointing it towards the corner. Rusty sat beside me, his body trembling, his eyes fixated on the darkened spot. As the hours ticked by, my fear grew. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath became visible in the frigid air. Rusty's growls grew more ferocious, his hackles raised. Suddenly, the figure appeared. He stepped out of the shadows, his smile wider, more menacing. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay still, to capture every detail on camera. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and he began to speak, his voice a chilling whisper that echoed in the silence. "You shouldn't have looked," he said, his smile never faltering. "Now, you've invited me in. Hey, subscribe for more scary stories." The air in my room felt heavy, suffocating, as the smiling man's words hung in the air. Rusty's growling grew more intense, and I could feel the vibrations through the bed. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and curiosity. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice trembling. The smiling man's grin widened impossibly, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "I've been here for a long time," he whispered, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "Waiting. For what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "For you to notice," he replied, his dark eyes glinting with malice. "Now that you have, we are bound." I shuddered, my mind racing to find some explanation, some way out of this nightmare. "What do you want?" My voice was barely audible over the pounding of my heart. He tilted his head, as if considering the question. "To play," he said finally, his tone playful yet sinister. "You see, it gets lonely here, in the shadows. And now, you're part of my game." Rusty's barks turned to whimpers, and he backed away, his eyes never leaving the figure in the corner. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but my hands refused to move. The smiling man took a step forward, and the temperature dropped even further. Frost formed on the window pane, and I could see my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to be brave. "I won't play your game," I said, though my voice betrayed my fear. "I won't let you terrorize me." The smiling man chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, but you already are," he said. "Every night, you feel my presence. Every night, you hear your dog's cries. You can't escape me." Desperation clawed at my chest. I had to find a way to end this, to banish the smiling man once and for all. My eyes darted to the camera, still recording everything. Maybe, just maybe, someone else could help me make sense of this. Someone who knew more about the supernatural. The following day, I contacted an old friend, Evelyn, who had always been fascinated by the paranormal. I explained everything to her, from Rusty's strange behavior to the horrifying footage on the camera. She listened intently, her face growing more serious with each passing moment. "This is bad," she said finally. "You've attracted a malevolent spirit. These entities feed on fear and grow stronger with each interaction. The more you engage with him, the more powerful he becomes." "What do I do?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. Evelyn glanced at the camera. "First, we need to cleanse your home. There are rituals, protections we can use. But you must be careful. One wrong move, and you could make things worse." We spent the next few hours preparing, gathering materials and setting up wards around the house. Evelyn guided me through each step, her knowledge and calm demeanor providing a sliver of hope. As night fell, the sense of dread returned, but this time, I felt a spark of determination. With Evelyn by my side, we entered my room. Rusty followed, his eyes wary but trusting. We began the ritual, chanting ancient words of protection and banishment. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to writhe with anger. The smiling man appeared again, his grin more twisted, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can get rid of me?" he hissed, his voice echoing with malice. "You are mine." But this time, I wasn't alone. Evelyn's voice joined mine, strong and unwavering. Together, we faced the entity, our voices rising in defiance. The room shook, the lights flickered, and for a moment, I feared we had failed. Then, with a final, ear-piercing scream, the smiling man vanished. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight lifted from the room. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. Rusty came to my side, licking my face and wagging his tail. Evelyn placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over," she said softly. "For now." Days passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The house felt lighter, and Rusty no longer barked at the corner of the room. Evelyn's ritual seemed to have worked, and I began to believe that the nightmare was finally over. I resumed my daily routine, but the memory of the smiling man lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness I had faced. One evening, I decided to take Rusty for a walk in the nearby woods. The air was crisp, and the fading sunlight cast long shadows on the ground. Rusty trotted happily beside me, his tail wagging in contentment. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded me for weeks. As we ventured deeper into the woods, a sense of unease began to creep in. The shadows grew longer, and the trees seemed to close in around us. Rusty stopped suddenly, his ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" I asked, looking around nervously. The woods were silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But Rusty's growl persisted, and his gaze was fixed on a darkened path ahead. Curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously followed Rusty's lead. The path led to a clearing, where an old, decrepit house stood. Its windows were broken, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. A chill ran down my spine as I approached the house, memories of the smiling man flooding back. Against my better judgment, I decided to explore the house. I tied Rusty to a tree nearby, not wanting to put him in danger. "Stay here, Rusty," I whispered. "I'll be right back." I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the remnants of furniture lay scattered around. As I ventured further, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. In the center of the living room, I found an old, tattered journal. The pages were yellowed with age, and the writing was barely legible. I flipped through the pages, my heart racing as I read the entries. They spoke of a man, a spirit who haunted the house, tormenting its inhabitants with his sinister smile. The final entry was dated decades ago and detailed a desperate attempt to banish the spirit. The writer described a ritual similar to the one Evelyn and I had performed. But something had gone wrong, and the smiling man had been released, free to roam and terrorize once more. A loud crash echoed through the house, and I jumped, dropping the journal. My heart pounded as I backed away, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to move, and a familiar, chilling voice whispered in my ear. "You thought you were free," the smiling man hissed. "But I'm still here, watching, waiting." Panic surged through me as I stumbled out of the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Rusty barked frantically, sensing my fear. I untied him and we ran, the sound of the smiling man's laughter echoing behind us. When we finally reached home, I collapsed on the couch, my mind racing. How had he returned? Had we failed to banish him completely? I grabbed my phone and called Evelyn, my hands shaking as I recounted what had happened. "This is worse than I thought," Evelyn said, her voice tense. "The smiling man must be tied to that house. We need to go back and finish what we started. But this time, we need to be prepared for anything." Fear gnawed at me, but I knew she was right. The smiling man was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and he wouldn't stop until he had claimed me. We had to confront him once more, to end his reign of terror for good. That night, Evelyn and I gathered our supplies and made our way back to the old house. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the decaying structure. As we stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the familiar sense of dread returned. "We need to find the source of his power," Evelyn whispered. "Something in this house is keeping him here." Together, we searched the house, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every creak and whisper set my nerves on edge. Then, in the basement, we found it, an old mirror, covered in dust and grime. Its surface was cracked, and an unnatural darkness seemed to seep from it. "This must be it," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to destroy it." As we prepared to shatter the mirror, the smiling man appeared, his eyes burning with rage. "You will not take this from me," he screamed, his voice echoing through the house. The smiling man lunged at us, his form twisting and contorting with a malevolent energy. Evelyn and I stood our ground, determined not to let him intimidate us. Rusty barked ferociously at the apparition, his courage bolstering our resolve. Evelyn thrust a silver dagger into my hand. "We need to break the mirror," she said urgently. "It's the source of his power. Without it, he'll be trapped and weakened." The smiling man's laughter filled the room, a chilling sound that reverberated through my bones. "You think you can defeat me?" he snarled, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. "I've existed for centuries. You are nothing but a fleeting moment in my eternal night." Ignoring his taunts, I gripped the dagger tightly and approached the mirror. The closer I got, the colder the air became, as if the very life was being sucked out of the room. Evelyn chanted incantations, her voice steady and strong, weaving a protective barrier around us. Just as I raised the dagger to strike, the smiling man's form shifted, and he appeared directly in front of me, his smile widening into an inhuman grimace. His eyes bored into mine, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by the sheer malevolence emanating from him. "You will not win," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "I will see to it that you suffer, that you know true despair." Summoning every ounce of courage, I swung the dagger with all my might. The blade connected with the mirror, and a deafening shatter filled the room. The mirror exploded into countless shards, each one reflecting the smiling man's horrified expression. A guttural scream tore from his throat as his form began to waver and dissolve. Evelyn continued her chants, her voice growing louder and more commanding. The air crackled with energy, and the room seemed to pulse with light. The smiling man's body disintegrated, his dark essence sucked into the void left by the shattered mirror. For a moment, everything was still. The oppressive weight lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. I sank to my knees, exhausted but relieved. Rusty nuzzled my side, his tail wagging in triumph. "We did it," I breathed, turning to Evelyn. "We actually did it." Evelyn nodded, though her expression was somber. "The mirror is destroyed, and the smiling man is weakened. But he's not gone. Spirits like him are resilient. We've only bought ourselves time." A sense of unease crept back in. "What do you mean? He can come back?" Evelyn sighed. "It's possible. We've broken his hold on this place, but his essence still lingers. We need to be vigilant to ensure he doesn't find another way back." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. We needed to be prepared for whatever might come next. Over the following weeks, we fortified the house with protective charms and wards. Evelyn taught me how to recognize signs of spiritual activity and how to strengthen my own defenses. Rusty remained by my side, his presence a comforting reminder of our shared ordeal. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a chill in the air. Rusty stirred at the foot of the bed, his ears perked up. I reached for my camera, now a constant companion, and switched it to night vision. Slowly, I panned it across the room. The corner where Rusty had once barked frantically was empty, but a sense of unease remained. I scanned the footage carefully, my heart pounding with every passing second. And then, I saw it. In the reflection of a small, cracked picture frame on the wall, a face appeared. It was the smiling man, his eyes dark and hollow, his grin as sinister as ever. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was unmistakable. Fear gripped me, but I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let him win. I would fight, no matter how many times he returned. This was my home, my life, and I wouldn't let him take it from me. As the night wore on, I sat in bed, camera in hand, ready for whatever might come. The battle against the smiling man was far from over, but I was no longer alone. With Rusty, Evelyn, and the knowledge I had gained, I would face him, again and again, until he was banished for good. And in the darkness, the smiling man watched, waiting for his next move. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Unseen Watcher. I moved into the old Victorian house with high hopes and a naive sense of adventure. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, with an eerie stillness that clung to the air. It was exactly the kind of place I had always dreamed of, a grand old home full of character and history. But, as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice strange occurrences that unsettled my initial excitement. The first sign was the garden. Beautifully overgrown, it seemed to have a life of its own. Every morning, I found the flower beds trampled, as if someone, or something, had been wandering through them. At first, I blamed local kids, vandals looking for a thrill. Frustrated, I decided to install a security camera to catch the culprits in the act. Little did I know, I was inviting something far more sinister into my life. One night, after setting up the camera, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I eagerly reviewed the footage, expecting to find evidence of mischievous teenagers. Instead, I found something that chilled me to the bone. There I was, lying in my bed, sleeping soundly. But in the background, barely audible, was a whisper. It was my name, repeated over and over, growing more insistent as the night progressed. I rewound the footage, convinced I had misheard. The whispers were unmistakable, though. Eli. 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 The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried an unsettling urgency. My heart pounded as I scanned the room and the video, looking for any sign of movement, any clue to who or what could be making those sounds. There was nothing. Just the static of the night and my own sleeping form. Determined to uncover the source of the whispers, I set up additional cameras around the house. Each night, the whispers grew louder, more persistent. Eli. 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 I could barely sleep, my mind racing with fear and confusion. During the day, I questioned my sanity. Could it be a prank? Some elaborate joke? But there was no one who knew about the cameras except me. The whispers began to seep into my waking life. I heard them in the shower, in the kitchen, even as I walked through the empty halls of the house. The once charming creaks and groans of the old building now felt like mocking reminders of my growing paranoia. Friends started to notice the dark circles under my eyes, the jumpiness in my demeanor. I tried to explain, but how could I make them understand? They would think I was losing my mind. One particularly harrowing night, I decided to stay awake, to confront whatever was haunting me. Armed with coffee and determination, I sat in my living room, eyes fixed on the camera feed. Midnight came and went, the house deathly silent. Just as I began to doubt myself, the whispering started again. Eli. 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 This time, it was different. The voice was closer, more intimate, as if it were right beside me. I felt a cold breath on my neck, and my blood ran cold. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the flickering shadows cast by the dim light. Panic set in. I couldn't stay in the house another minute. I grabbed my keys and fled, not daring to look back. As I drove away, the whispers faded, but the fear lingered. That night, I stayed at a friend's place, too afraid to return to the house. In the safety of daylight, I resolved to seek help. Someone had to believe me. Someone had to know how to make the whispers stop. The next morning, I contacted a local historian, hoping he could shed some light on the house's past. Dr. Howard was an eccentric man with a passion for the macabre. He arrived at my doorstep with a stack of old documents and a gleam of excitement in his eyes. As we sat in the kitchen, the daylight filtering through the windows offered a brief respite from the dread that had settled over me. This house has quite a history, Dr. Howard began, spreading out yellowed papers and photographs. Built in the late 1800s, it was originally owned by the Holloway family. They were well respected in the community, but their story took a dark turn. He paused, glancing at me to gauge my reaction. I nodded, urging him to continue. According to local legend, the youngest daughter, Eliza Holloway, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. She was said to have been deeply troubled, hearing voices no one else could. After her disappearance, the family left the house, and it changed hands many times, each new owner reporting strange occurrences until they too abandoned it. The name Eliza sent a shiver down my spine. Eli. Eli. The whispers had been calling out a name so similar to mine. It couldn't be a coincidence. Do you think she's still here? I asked, my voice trembling. Dr. Howard leaned back, his expression thoughtful. It's possible. Restless spirits are often tied to unresolved trauma or unfinished business. Eliza's fate remains a mystery, and perhaps she's trying to communicate something. Desperate for answers, I decided to conduct a seance. Dr. Howard, intrigued by the idea, offered to assist. That evening, we gathered in the living room, the air thick with anticipation and fear. The house was eerily silent, the usual creaks and whispers absent as if it too were holding its breath. We sat around a small table, candles flickering, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. Dr. Howard led the ritual, calling out to Eliza Holloway, asking her to reveal herself. For a long time, nothing happened. The silence was oppressive, each tick of the clock magnifying my anxiety. Then, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the candles flickered wildly. A faint, barely perceptible whisper began to fill the air. Eli. Eli. The voice was unmistakable, the same one from the recordings. Dr. Howard's eyes widened as he scribbled notes, but I could barely focus, my heart pounding in my chest. Eliza, I called out, my voice shaking. What do you want? Why are you haunting me? The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just my name, but a jumble of words, phrases I couldn't quite understand. I closed my eyes, trying to concentrate, to make sense of the chaos. Suddenly, a rush of cold air enveloped me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow and fear. Images flashed through my mind: an old wooden door, a darkened room, and a young girl, terrified and alone. I gasped, snapping back to reality. Dr. Howard was watching me intently, concern etched on his face. "Did you see something?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I nodded, struggling to find the words. "A door, a room." She was so scared, I whispered. Dr. Howard frowned, deep in thought. "We need to find that room," he said finally. "It might hold the key to understanding Eliza's torment." Determined to uncover the truth, we began searching the house, combing through every nook and cranny. Hours passed, but we found nothing. Just as despair began to set in, Dr. Howard called out from the basement. I rushed down the creaky stairs to find him standing before an old, locked door, hidden behind a stack of dusty boxes. "This must be it," he said, his voice filled with anticipation. With trembling hands, I reached for the key hanging on a nearby nail. As the lock clicked open, a sense of foreboding washed over me. Whatever lay behind that door, I knew it would change everything. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. As I stepped in, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and a chill ran down my spine. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single, dusty bed pushed against the far wall and a tattered doll sitting on it. It looked as though it had been untouched for decades. Dr. Howard followed closely behind, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "This must have been her room," he said quietly, his voice reverberating in the confined space. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the remnants of a lifelong past. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing off the walls. "Eli. Eli." They seemed to surround me, pressing in from all sides. We began to search the room, looking for anything that might explain Eliza's fate. Under the bed, we found an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. My hands shook as I opened it, the whispers growing more agitated. The entries were written in a delicate, flowing script, detailing the life of a young girl tormented by unseen forces. She spoke of voices in the night, cold touches, and a growing sense of dread that consumed her every waking moment. One entry, in particular, caught my eye. It was dated just days before her disappearance. "The whispers are getting louder. They call my name every night, urging me to come to them. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I'm so scared." The words were smeared, as if she had been crying while writing them. My heart ached for her, the fear and isolation she must have felt. As I read, the whispers intensified, becoming almost a wail. Dr. Howard placed a hand on my shoulder, his face pale. "We need to do something," he said urgently. "We can't let her suffer any longer." I nodded, my resolve hardening. We decided to perform a ritual to help Eliza find peace, to release her from the torment that had bound her to this house for so long. That night, we gathered in the forgotten room, armed with candles, incense, and a book of ancient rites Dr. Howard had brought. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation and fear. As we began the ritual, the temperature plummeted, our breath visible in the frigid air. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining. Dr. Howard chanted in a language I didn't understand, his voice steady and strong. I closed my eyes, focusing on Eliza, willing her to find peace. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the silence, and the room was plunged into darkness. The candles flickered out, and I felt a cold hand grip mine. I gasped, my eyes flying open, but I saw nothing. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a frantic, desperate plea. "Eli. Eli." I felt a tug on my arm, pulling me towards the wall. I resisted, fear clawing at my throat. Dr. Howard's chanting grew louder, more insistent. "Let her go," he commanded, his voice booming in the small room. The grip tightened, and then, as abruptly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, the sudden absence of noise almost painful. The candles reignited, casting a soft, warm glow over the room. I looked around, my heart pounding. The sense of foreboding had lifted, replaced by a strange calm. Dr. Howard let out a breath he had been holding, his shoulders slumping in relief. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I believe so. I think we've given her the peace she needed." I felt a wave of emotion crash over me, relief, sorrow, and a lingering sense of connection to the girl whose whispers had haunted my nights. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave the room, I noticed something on the floor where the bed had been. A small, intricately carved box. I picked it up, curiosity piqued. Inside was a locket, its gold chain glinting in the candlelight. I opened it to find a tiny portrait of Eliza, her eyes sad but hopeful. It felt like a parting gift, a token of gratitude. We left the room, locking the door behind us. As I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the house was different now. The whispers were gone, but their memory lingered, a reminder of the unseen forces that had once held sway over my life. I hoped Eliza had finally found the peace she deserved. Just as we reached the top of the stairs, the front door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. The air turned icy once more, and the faintest whisper echoed through the hall. "Eli. Eli." It seemed I had underestimated the depths of the house's secrets. The slamming door reverberated through the house, a jarring reminder that the haunting was far from over. Dr. Howard and I exchanged a look of mutual dread. The calm we had felt just moments before was shattered, replaced by a renewed sense of urgency and fear. We hadn't freed Eliza after all, something else still lingered in the shadows. Determined to uncover the final piece of the puzzle, we retraced our steps, looking for any clues we might have missed. The house seemed to mock us, the once comforting daylight now dimmed by gathering storm clouds outside. The whispers returned, more insistent than ever. "Eli. Eli." It felt like a countdown, urging us towards some inevitable conclusion. We decided to revisit the basement. The air grew colder with each step, the whispers louder. Dr. Howard and I searched every corner, but found nothing new. Frustration mounted until Dr. Howard paused, his gaze fixed on a section of the wall. "This doesn't match the rest," he muttered, running his fingers over the surface. It was smoother, less aged. Without hesitation, we began to pry at the paneling, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside was an old, weathered journal, one that didn't belong to Eliza. The name on the cover sent a chill through me, Jonathan Holloway. He was Eliza's father, the man who had built the house. As we flipped through the pages, the horror of what had transpired here unfolded. Jonathan had been a deeply disturbed man, obsessed with the occult and dark rituals. Eliza's torments were not the result of random hauntings, but his own twisted experiments. The final entries revealed the extent of his madness. He had been trying to bind a powerful spirit to the house, using Eliza as a conduit. When she resisted, he locked her away in the secret room, hoping to break her will. Her whispers were a cry for help, but also a warning. The ritual had failed, but it had left a malevolent presence behind, one that had been awakened by our attempts to free her. "She's not the one haunting you," Dr. Howard said, his voice grim. "It's him. Jonathan's spirit is still here, and it's angry." The realization was like a punch to the gut. All this time, we had been focusing on the wrong ghost. We needed to confront Jonathan, to end his reign of terror once and for all. Gathering what courage we had left, we returned to the hidden room. The air was thick with malice, the temperature plummeting as we stepped inside. Dr. Howard began to chant, this time invoking a banishment spell. The room darkened, the shadows deepening into an impenetrable blackness. The whispers turned into a guttural growl, and then a figure materialized before us, a gaunt, spectral form with hollow eyes that burned with hatred. "Leave this place," Dr. Howard commanded, his voice shaking but resolute. The spirit of Jonathan Holloway loomed over us, its presence oppressive and suffocating. "You have no power here anymore." The growl turned into a scream, a sound so filled with rage and pain that it felt like it would tear the very walls apart. I stepped forward, holding the locket with Eliza's portrait. "You used your own daughter for your sick experiments. You've caused enough suffering. It's time for you to go." The ghost's eyes flickered to the locket, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or sorrow. But then the rage returned, more intense than ever. Dr. Howard's chanting reached a crescendo, and the spirit lashed out. A force like a hurricane knocked us back, but we held our ground. The room seemed to collapse around us, the very foundations of the house shaking. And then, with one final, ear-splitting scream, the spirit dissipated, leaving behind an echoing silence. The aftermath was surreal. The house felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The whispers were gone, replaced by an almost palpable sense of peace. Dr. Howard and I emerged from the basement, exhausted but victorious. The storm outside had passed, the sun breaking through the clouds in a brilliant display of light. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild my life. The haunting had left its mark, but it had also brought a sense of closure. Eliza was free, and the malevolent force that had bound her was no more. I kept the locket as a reminder of the ordeal, a symbol of resilience and hope. But as I lay in bed one night, drifting off to sleep, I thought I heard a faint whisper. "Eli." I sat up, heart pounding, but the house remained silent. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just the lingering memories of a haunting that was finally, truly over. Or was it? Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. The laughter that never was. The last thing I remember before the car crash was my sister's laughter from the back seat. I don't have a sister. That haunting, melodic sound echoed in my mind as I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the distant beeping of monitors. My head throbbed, and my vision blurred, but the memory of that laughter remained crystal clear. It gnawed at me, a sharp reminder of something that should not exist. "How are you feeling, Mr. Harris?" a nurse asked, her voice a blend of concern and professionalism. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I replied, trying to mask my confusion with humor. "What happened?" "You were in a car accident." "You're lucky to be alive," she said, checking my vitals. "Do you remember anything about the crash?" I hesitated, the memory of the laughter surfacing again. "Not much. Just a sound. Someone laughing." The nurse gave me a puzzled look. "There was no one else in the car with you when they found you," she said, and with a comforting pat on my arm, she left the room. I spent the next few days recovering, each moment a blur of medical procedures and rest. But the laughter lingered. It haunted my dreams, turning them into twisted nightmares where a shadowy figure with my eyes and a sinister smile watched me from the darkness. Every time I woke up, the fear clung to me like a second skin. Discharged with a clean bill of health, I returned to my apartment, hoping to find solace in the familiarity of my own space. But the moment I stepped through the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive silence that set my nerves on edge. I walked through each room, half expecting to find something out of place. The living room was as I had left it, with books scattered on the coffee table and a blanket draped over the couch. The kitchen smelled faintly of the last meal I had cooked, and my bedroom was untouched. Yet, something was off. It was as if an unseen presence was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the crash replayed in my mind. The laughter, the sudden swerve, the impact. It all came rushing back, accompanied by a cold, eerie sensation. I turned on my side, trying to shake off the unease, but sleep eluded me. Then, in the dead of night, I heard it again. The laughter. Soft, distant, yet unmistakably coming from the other side of my bedroom door. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and my blood ran cold. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I got out of bed, my legs unsteady, and approached the door. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pulled it open. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stepped into the hallway, feeling the cold tiles beneath my feet. The laughter echoed again, this time from the living room. I moved cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. As I entered the living room, the laughter stopped, replaced by a whisper. "Come play with me." "Hey, subscribe for more scary stories." I froze, the whisper sending a shiver down my spine. The voice was soft, almost playful, but there was an edge to it that filled me with dread. The living room was empty, just as I had left it, but the shadows seemed to dance around me, mocking my fear. I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of the source. "Come play with me," the voice repeated, closer this time. It was a child's voice, innocent yet chilling. I turned towards the sound, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the corner of the room, stood a little girl. She was no more than 6 years old, with long dark hair and eyes that gleamed in the moonlight. She wore a white dress, stained with what looked like dirt and blood. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The girl tilted her head, a smile spreading across her face. "Don't you remember me, brother?" she asked, her voice echoing in the room. "We used to play together all the time." Panic surged through me. "I don't have a sister," I said, backing away. "You're not real." She giggled, the sound piercing the silence. "Oh, but I am real. You just forgot about me." "But I never forgot about you." I shook my head, trying to make sense of the situation. This had to be a nightmare, a lingering effect of the accident. But the fear was too real, the coldness of the room too sharp to be a dream. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" She took a step forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "I want to play, like we used to. But you have to remember, brother. You have to remember everything." The air around me grew colder, and I felt a pressure on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Memories that I couldn't place began to surface, fragments of a past that didn't belong to me. A house in the woods, a swing set, a little girl laughing as we played hide and seek. But it didn't make sense. These weren't my memories. "Stop," I pleaded, clutching my head. "I don't understand." The girl stopped, her expression softening. "You will," she said gently. "But you have to come with me." Before I could respond, the room began to spin, the shadows closing in around me. I felt myself falling, the world fading to black. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in my apartment. I was standing in front of an old, dilapidated house, its windows boarded up and the paint peeling off in strips. The air was thick with the smell of decay and mold. "Where am I?" I muttered, looking around. The girl stood beside me, her hands slipping into mine. "Home," she said simply, pulling me towards the house. "Come on, brother. It's time to remember." I followed her, my mind reeling. This place felt familiar, like a forgotten dream. The door creaked open as we approached, revealing a dark hallway lined with family portraits. I recognized the faces in the pictures, but the details were hazy, like a photograph out of focus. "This way," the girl said, leading me to a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and a soft light seeped through the crack. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but the girl squeezed my hand reassuringly. As we stepped into the room, I was hit by a wave of déjà vu. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a small bed sat in the corner, its sheets neatly tucked in. The walls were covered in drawings, some faded with age, others fresh and vibrant. "Do you remember now?" the girl asked, looking up at me with hopeful eyes. I nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. This was our room. Our home. But something terrible had happened here, something I had buried deep within my subconscious. Before I could speak, the door slammed shut behind us, and the temperature dropped. The girl stepped away from me, her expression shifting from innocence to malevolence. "Now, let's play," she said, her voice echoing with a sinister edge. The sudden change in her demeanor sent a jolt of fear through me. The room darkened, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist, coming to life around us. I felt a cold breeze brush against my skin, carrying with it the faint, eerie sound of children's laughter. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice shaking. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We used to play all the time, but you left me alone. Now it's my turn to play with you." The room transformed before my eyes. The walls stretched, the ceiling rose, and the floorboards creaked as if the house itself was breathing. The drawings on the walls seemed to move, shifting into grotesque images of faces twisted in pain. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to grasp the reality of what I was seeing. "Remember the game, brother?" she asked, her voice echoing. "Hide and seek." A surge of memories hit me, fragments of a past life I had forgotten. I saw myself as a child, running through this very house, hiding in closets and under beds while the girl counted. But there was something more, something darker that my mind had repressed. "You were never supposed to leave," she whispered, her voice now cold and filled with a deep sadness. "You promised to stay with me forever." I shook my head, trying to clear the confusion. "I didn't know," I said, my voice barely audible. "I don't remember." Her eyes flared with anger. "You will," she hissed. "And then you'll stay with me, just like you promised." The room began to spin again, and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness. I fought against it, but the pull was too strong. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the void. When I opened them again, I was no longer in the house. I was standing in the middle of a dense forest, the trees towering above me like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with fog, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. I turned in a circle, disoriented and terrified. "Where are you?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "Right here," the girl's voice replied, but it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around to see her standing there, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Because you forgot me," she said simply. "And I can't let that happen." I took a step back, my mind racing. "What do you want me to do?" She tilted her head, her expression softening slightly. "Remember. Remember everything." As the words left her lips, memories began to flood my mind. I saw flashes of our childhood, playing in the woods, laughing together. But there were darker memories too. I remembered the accident, the crash that had killed her. The guilt I had carried, the way I had blocked out the pain by erasing her from my memory. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." She reached out, her hand gentle on my cheek. "It's not enough," she said softly. "You need to stay with me." The forest around us grew darker, the shadows closing in. I felt a chill run through me as I realized what she meant. She wanted me to join her in death, to stay in this limbo forever. "No," I said, stepping back. "I can't." Her eyes hardened. "You don't have a choice." Before I could react, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling into darkness once more. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the house, lying on the cold, hard floor of the room we had shared. The girl stood over me, her expression unreadable. "It's time to play, brother," she said, her voice echoing with finality. I pushed myself up from the floor, my body aching from the fall. The room felt even colder now, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. The girl stood before me, her eyes glowing with a sinister light. The shadows in the room seemed to pulsate, alive with a malevolent energy. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice cracking with fear and desperation. "Why won't you let me go?" She tilted her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "You left me alone," she said softly. "You broke your promise. Now, you have to stay with me." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of confusion and fear that clouded my thoughts. "I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. What promise? She stepped closer, her eyes boring into mine. You promised we would be together forever. But you left me. You forgot about me. Now, you have to remember. The room around us began to shift, the walls melting away to reveal a dark, twisted version of the forest where we used to play. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if it could give way at any moment. Come with me, she said, holding out her hand. Let's play one last game. I hesitated, my mind racing. I didn't want to play her game, but I knew I had no choice. I took her hand, feeling the coldness of her touch seep into my skin. She led me through the twisted forest, the shadows closing in around us. We stopped in a small clearing, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on the scene. In the center of the clearing was a small, decrepit playhouse, its paint peeling and its windows broken. It looked just like the one we used to play in, but twisted and corrupted by time. This is where it happened, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is where you left me. The memories came rushing back, hitting me like a tidal wave. I remembered the day we had played in the forest, the way we had laughed and chased each other. And then the accident. The car swerving off the road, crashing into the trees. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was her laughter, so out of place and haunting. I didn't mean to leave you, I said, tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean to forget you. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and anger. But you did, she said. And now, you have to stay with me. Forever. The ground beneath us began to shake, and I felt a cold hand grip my heart. The playhouse started to crumble, the shadows closing in around us. I felt myself being pulled into the darkness, the coldness seeping into my bones. No! I screamed, fighting against the pull. I won't stay here. I won't let you take me. Her grip tightened, her eyes blazing with a terrible fury. You don't have a choice, she hissed. You belong to me now. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, trying to break free from her grasp. But the darkness was relentless, and I could feel myself slipping away. In my last desperate moment, I remembered something. A fragment of a memory, a promise I had made to myself. I will remember you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I will never forget you again. The world around me seemed to pause, the darkness hesitating for a moment. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. Promise, she asked, her voice softening. Promise, I said, tears streaming down my face. I will remember you. Always. The grip on my heart loosened, and I felt myself being lifted out of the darkness. The forest began to fade, the shadows retreating. The last thing I saw was her face, a sad smile playing on her lips. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor. The room was cold, but the oppressive feeling was gone. I got up slowly, my body aching, and looked around. The house was silent, but the memory of her laughter still echoed in my mind. I knew I would never forget her again. She was a part of me, a part of my past that I could never escape. But as long as I remembered her, she would never be alone. And neither would I. Story 4. The Echoes of Morning. I woke up to the sound of my mother calling me for breakfast, which would be normal if she hadn't passed away in this very house 3 years ago. The familiarity of her voice sent a shiver down my spine as I sat up in bed, my heart pounding against my ribcage. It was unmistakable, the lilting cadence, the affectionate warmth that had once filled our kitchen every morning. For a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming, but the cold sweat on my forehead and the gnawing fear in my gut told me otherwise. The room was bathed in the early morning light, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe on the walls. I hesitated before getting out of bed, my mind racing through every logical explanation. Perhaps it was a trick of my memory, a cruel hallucination. But deep down, I knew the house had never been normal since her passing. There had been whispers, fleeting shadows, and a coldness that seeped into my bones no matter how high I turned up the thermostat. I dressed quickly, my fingers trembling as I buttoned my shirt. The hallway outside my bedroom felt longer than usual, the air heavy with an unseen presence. As I approached the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon hit me, the same way it had every morning of my childhood. The kitchen was exactly as she had left it, every detail meticulously preserved in my grief. But today, something was different. "Mom?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The clinking of plates and the soft hum of an old tune responded, yet no figure stood at the stove. The chair at the head of the table, where she always sat, creaked as if someone had just risen from it. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to move forward, my eyes scanning every corner for a sign of the impossible. Then, I saw it, a shadow that moved with intent, not just a trick of the light. It slid across the floor and up the wall, pausing at the spot where my mother's favorite portrait hung. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow seemed to solidify, taking on a more human shape, albeit distorted and ethereal. I blinked hard, hoping to dispel the apparition, but it remained, growing more defined with each passing second. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice firmer than I felt. The shadow shifted slightly, almost as if acknowledging my presence. Then, a whisper, faint yet unmistakable, filled the room. "It's me, darling. Don't you recognize your own mother?" Terror and disbelief clashed within me. I wanted to run, to leave this cursed house behind, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The shadow moved closer, and as it did, the room's temperature plummeted. Frost began to creep over the windows, and my breath came out in visible puffs. "Mom, how is this possible?" My voice quivered, betraying the fear I tried to suppress. The shadow hesitated, then slowly raised what appeared to be a hand. "I never truly left, my dear. I've been watching over you, waiting for the right moment to return." There was a sorrow in her voice, a longing that tugged at the edges of my consciousness. As much as the logical part of me screamed to reject this, my heart ached with a desperate hope. Before I could respond, the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the house, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were not my father's. He had left this world soon after my mother, unable to bear the weight of his loss. No, these footsteps were different, filled with a menacing purpose that set every nerve in my body on edge. The shadow of my mother seemed to shudder, and she whispered urgently, "You must hide. He's coming." "Who? Who's coming?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. But the shadow only repeated her warning, "Hide, now." I had no choice but to obey, the primal instinct to survive overriding every other thought. I darted into the pantry, closing the door just enough to see through the crack, my breath shallow and silent. As the footsteps drew nearer, a figure emerged at the threshold of the kitchen, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in an aura of darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. I could see nothing of its face, but its presence alone was enough to chill me to my core. It paused, as if sensing my hiding spot, and then it spoke in a voice that was both a growl and a whisper, "I know you're here. You cannot escape me." I pressed myself against the back wall of the pantry, my heart thundering in my chest. The figure moved through the kitchen with deliberate slowness, its every step sending vibrations through the floor. I could barely breathe, terrified that even the slightest sound would give me away. From my hiding spot, I watched as it seemed to sniff the air, its movements jerky and unnatural. Come out, wherever you are," it crooned, its voice a grotesque parody of a nursery rhyme. The sing-song quality made my skin crawl, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. The shadow of my mother flickered at the edge of my vision, her form less distinct, as if struggling to maintain her presence. The creature paused by the pantry door, and I could see its fingers, long, bony, and tipped with blackened nails, trailing along the wood. It seemed to sense my fear, reveling in the terror it caused. I closed my eyes, willing myself to be invisible, to become part of the darkness. For a few agonizing moments, everything was silent except for the pounding of my heart. Then, abruptly, the figure moved away, its attention drawn elsewhere. I let out a shaky breath, daring to hope that it hadn't found me. But the reprieve was short-lived. The kitchen lights flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. The air grew even colder, and I could hear a low, guttural growl emanating from the creature as it searched the room. "Mother," I whispered as quietly as I could, "what is that thing?" There was no answer, only a sense of urgency that pressed down on me like a weight. The shadow that was my mother seemed to be directing me to something, but in my panic, I couldn't understand what. The creature let out a frustrated snarl and began overturning chairs, smashing plates, and upending the table. It was looking for me, growing more furious with every passing second. I knew I couldn't stay hidden much longer. My eyes darted around the pantry, searching for anything that could help me. That's when I saw it, a small, rusted key hanging on a hook by the door. It was old, an heirloom that my mother had always been oddly protective of. Without fully understanding why, I reached for the key. The moment my fingers closed around it, I felt a strange warmth spread through my hand, as if the key itself was alive. The creature stopped suddenly, its head snapping in my direction. It knew. I clutched the key to my chest and held my breath, waiting for the inevitable. But instead of tearing the pantry door off its hinges, the creature seemed to hesitate. It let out a low, keening wail that was almost human, and then it began to retreat, slinking back into the shadows from whence it came. The kitchen fell eerily silent, the oppressive weight of the creature's presence lifting slightly. I stayed hidden for several more minutes, too terrified to move. Finally, when I was sure the creature was gone, I crept out of the pantry, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. The kitchen was a wreck, the aftermath of the creature's rage evident in the shattered dishes and overturned furniture. "Mom," I called softly, "what do I do now?" The shadow of my mother reappeared, more defined than before. She drifted toward me, her ethereal form radiating a sense of urgency and sorrow. "The key," she whispered, her voice a mere breath of sound. "It opens the door to the past. You must find the lock, but beware, he will follow." I stared at the key, its intricate design hinting at a long-forgotten history. "The past? What do you mean?" I asked, but the shadow was already fading, her energy spent. "Find the lock," was all she said before disappearing entirely. The house seemed to close in around me, its walls a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded. I had no choice but to trust my mother's words, cryptic as they were. The key was my only lead, and somewhere in this old house, there was a lock that it would open. As I made my way through the hallways, the floorboards creaking underfoot, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house, with its dark corners and hidden memories, was alive with the echoes of the past. And somewhere in the shadows, the creature waited, hungry and relentless. With the key in hand, I ventured deeper into the house, each step echoing through the silent halls. The house had always felt imposing, its Victorian architecture filled with nooks and crannies that seemed to hide secrets. Today, it felt more like a labyrinth, every turn and shadow a potential hiding place for the creature. The key seemed to pulse with a strange energy, guiding me towards some unseen destination. I found myself in front of the old library, a room my parents had loved, but which had been locked since their deaths. The door was heavy, made of dark, polished oak, and it bore a lock that looked ancient. My hands shook as I inserted the key, the metal cold against my skin. With a click, the door swung open, revealing the library's dim interior. Dust motes floated in the beams of light that filtered through the heavy curtains. The air was thick with the scent of old books and forgotten memories. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath me, and closed the door behind me. The room felt safe, insulated from the malevolent presence that stalked the halls. But I knew it wouldn't last. The library was filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, each crammed with volumes that covered a myriad of subjects. In the center of the room was a large, ornate desk, and behind it, a portrait of my mother in her younger years. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, a reminder of the task at hand. I began to search, opening drawers and scanning the shelves, looking for any clue as to what the key might unlock next. My search was interrupted by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It seemed to come from behind the bookshelves, a soft susurration that sent chills down my spine. I approached the source of the sound, my breath shallow, and began pulling books off the shelf. My fingers found a hidden latch, and with a tug, a section of the bookshelf swung open, revealing a narrow passageway. The passage was dark and foreboding, the air colder than the rest of the house. The walls were lined with old portraits and photographs, faces that seemed familiar and yet distant. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the key clutched tightly in my hand. The door closed behind me with a soft thud, plunging me into near darkness. I followed the passage, the walls pressing in on me as I moved deeper into the house's hidden recesses. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could almost make out words among the murmurs. The passage ended at a small, unassuming door, the wood aged and cracked. There was a lock, and with a trembling hand, I inserted the key. The door swung open to reveal a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it, an old, leather-bound book. The room was otherwise empty, the walls bare except for a single, small window that let in a sliver of light. I approached the pedestal cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The book was covered in dust, the leather cracked and worn. I brushed off the dust and opened it, the pages yellowed with age. The book was filled with writings and symbols that I couldn't understand, but one page stood out. It bore a sketch of a door and a key, along with a single word, resonance. I traced the drawing with my finger, a sense of recognition washing over me. This was the key to understanding what was happening, to unlocking the secrets of the house and my mother's presence. As I turned to leave, a sudden chill filled the room. The shadows deepened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. The creature had found me. I could hear its raspy breathing, feel its malevolent gaze. My escape route was blocked, the narrow passage now a trap. The only way out was through the small window. I rushed to the window, prying it open with desperate strength. The wood splintered under my hands, but it gave way, opening just enough for me to squeeze through. As I pulled myself out, I felt a cold, bony hand brush against my ankle, a final, grasping attempt to capture me. I kicked free and fell to the ground outside, the book clutched tightly to my chest. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear the creature's enraged howl echoing from the hidden room, a sound that would haunt my dreams. The house loomed behind me, a dark silhouette against the morning sky. I had escaped, but I knew it wasn't over. The book held answers, and somewhere in its pages, I would find a way to end this nightmare. With the old book clutched tightly to my chest, I stumbled away from the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The early morning light felt alien, a stark contrast to the darkness within the house. I found refuge under a large oak tree, its gnarled branches offering a semblance of protection. My mind raced as I flipped through the book, desperate for any clue that could help me understand the horrors I faced. The book's pages were filled with cryptic symbols and indecipherable text, but a recurring motif caught my eye, the same key and door sketch I had seen earlier. Next to it, a series of drawings depicted a ritual, one that seemed to involve invoking and binding spirits. As I studied the drawings, a plan began to form in my mind. If this book held the secrets to binding spirits, perhaps it also held the key to banishing them. I spent the next few hours piecing together what I could from the book. It described a ritual that required specific items, a mirror, a candle, and a personal artifact belonging to the spirit. I knew exactly where to find these items within the house, but the thought of going back inside filled me with dread. Still, I had no choice. If I wanted to end this nightmare, I had to confront the creature and perform the ritual. With renewed determination, I made my way back to the house. The air seemed to thicken as I approached, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavily on me. I steeled myself and stepped inside, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the creature. The house was eerily silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation. I first went to the attic, where my mother's old belongings were stored. Among them, I found a hand mirror, tarnished with age but still intact. Next, I retrieved a candle from the dining room, its wax slightly melted from the last time it was used. Finally, I made my way to my mother's bedroom, where her favorite locket lay on the dresser. The sight of it brought a pang of sadness, but I knew it was necessary for the ritual. Armed with the required items, I returned to the library. the hidden passage was still open, a gaping maw that led to the heart of the house's secrets. I set up the ritual in the small room where I had found the book, placing the mirror, candle, and locket in a circle as depicted in the drawings. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and I knew the creature was close. I lit the candle and began to recite the incantation from the book. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but I pushed through, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. As I chanted, the shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, converging towards the circle. The temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the freezing air. The creature emerged from the darkness, its form more defined and terrifying than before. It let out a guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the room. "You cannot banish me," it hissed, its voice a mixture of rage and desperation. "I am bound to this house, to your blood." I ignored its words and continued the incantation, focusing on the locket. It began to glow, a soft, golden light that seemed to push back the darkness. The creature howled in pain, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Leave us!" I shouted, my voice echoing with newfound strength. "Return to the void from which you came." The creature lunged at me, its claws outstretched, but it was too late. The ritual reached its climax, and a blinding light filled the room. The shadows recoiled, the creature's scream a final, chilling note before it was pulled into the mirror. The glass shattered, the pieces falling to the floor with a sound like distant thunder. Silence fell, the oppressive weight lifted from the air. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The house seemed different, the malevolent presence gone. I knew it was over. The creature was banished, and my mother's spirit was finally at peace. As I stood up, the morning light filtered through the small window, casting a warm glow over the room. I looked at the pieces of the broken mirror, a sense of closure settling over me. The house was no longer a place of fear, but a place of memories, both good and bad. I left the hidden room and made my way to the front door, the book still in hand. As I stepped outside, the sun rose higher, banishing the last remnants of the night. I knew there were still questions unanswered, but for now, I was content. I had faced my fears and emerged victorious. As I walked away from the house, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The shadows were gone, the house standing silent and serene. I took a deep breath and continued down the path, ready to embrace whatever came next, free from the echoes of mourning. Story 5. The Unseen Hand. It started with the whispers, faint and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. At first, I dismissed them as the creaks and groans of my old Victorian house, a relic from the 19th century nestled on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could no longer ignore them. I moved into the house 3 months ago, eager to escape the chaos of the city and find solace in the tranquility of the countryside. The house, with its ornate architecture and overgrown garden, seemed to call to me, promising a fresh start. Little did I know, it had other plans. My first night was uneventful. I unpacked my belongings, cooked a simple dinner, and settled into my new life. The next morning, I noticed small things out of place, a chair slightly askew, a book that had moved from the shelf to the table. I brushed it off as my imagination, perhaps the result of fatigue from the move. As days turned into weeks, the occurrences became more frequent. Shadows flitted at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look. Objects moved without explanation, and a chilling draft seemed to follow me from room to room. I began to feel as though I was being watched, a constant prickling at the back of my neck. One particularly cold night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were clearer now, a soft murmur that I could almost understand. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear, but the words eluded me. Then, just as I was drifting into sleep, I felt it, a gentle, almost loving stroke of fingers through my hair. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark and silent, the only sound the frantic beating of my heart. I fumbled for the lamp on my bedside table and switched it on, flooding the room with light. There was no one there. I was alone. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a dream, a trick of the mind. But the sensation was too real, too vivid to dismiss. I could still feel the lingering touch on my scalp, a cold shiver running down my spine. I slept with the light on that night, but it brought little comfort. Over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent and the touches more insistent. I could no longer ignore the presence in my home. Desperation drove me to the town library, where I delved into the history of the house. What I found was both fascinating and horrifying. The house had belonged to a family named the Eldreds, who had mysteriously vanished over a century ago. Rumors of hauntings and ghostly apparitions plagued the property, driving away previous owners. The townsfolk avoided the house, claiming it was cursed. They spoke of dark rituals and restless spirits, of a tragedy that had left its mark on the very walls. Armed with this knowledge, I returned home, determined to uncover the truth. As night fell, I prepared myself for another encounter, my mind racing with questions. Who, or what, was in my house? And what did it want from me? The whispers grew louder, filling the air with an eerie, unsettling melody. I felt a cold breath on my neck and turned slowly. In the dim light, a shadowy figure stood at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand, and I felt the familiar, chilling touch of fingers brushing through my hair. Hey, subscribe for more scary stories. Paralyzed with fear, I stared at the shadowy figure, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure's eyes seemed to pierce through me, filling me with a cold dread that seeped into my bones. I wanted to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. The figure's hand continued to stroke my hair, an unnervingly gentle touch that belied its terrifying presence. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the figure was trying to communicate. I strained to make sense of the words, but they remained just beyond my grasp. Suddenly, the figure stepped back, its form dissipating into the shadows. The room plunged into silence, leaving me gasping for breath. The next morning, I resolved to learn more about the Eldred family. I needed to understand who, or what, was haunting me and why. I visited the town's oldest resident, Mrs. Hawthorne, hoping she could shed some light on the house's dark history. Her eyes widened when I mentioned the Eldreds, and she invited me in, her demeanor shifting from curiosity to concern. The Eldred family was well known in these parts, Mrs. Hawthorne began, her voice low and grave. They were wealthy, but they had their secrets. Rumors of strange rituals and dark magic surrounded them. One night, they vanished without a trace. Some say they were taken by the spirits they tried to control. I listened, enthralled and horrified, as Mrs. Hawthorne recounted the tale. The family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Eldred and their 2 children, Evelyn and Thomas. According to legend, Evelyn had a special gift, the ability to communicate with the dead. The family had moved to the house to harness this power, performing rituals to contact the spirit world. But something went terribly wrong. Some believe Evelyn's powers unleashed something dark, Mrs. Hawthorne continued, her eyes clouded with memories. The night they disappeared, neighbors heard screams and saw strange lights. The next morning, the house was empty, and the family was never seen again. Many think their spirits are still trapped there, seeking release. Armed with this new information, I returned home, determined to free the spirits and put an end to the haunting. I spent hours researching rituals and protective spells, hoping to find a way to communicate with the entities. As night fell, I prepared myself for another encounter, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. I lit candles around the room, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. Clutching a book of ancient incantations, I began to recite a ritual to summon the spirits. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, louder and more coherent. I could hear distinct voices now, pleading, desperate, and full of sorrow. Suddenly, the figure reappeared, but this time it wasn't alone. 2 smaller figures stood beside it, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light. "Help us," a soft, child's voice whispered, sending chills down my spine. It was Evelyn. She reached out to me, her ghostly form flickering in the candlelight. "We are trapped." I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "How can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. Evelyn's eyes filled with a profound sadness as she began to speak. She told me of the dark ritual that had gone wrong, how they had accidentally bound their souls to the house. "We need you to finish the ritual," Evelyn said, her voice a haunting echo. "Release us, and we will leave you in peace." The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to press in on me, but I nodded, determined to end this nightmare. I followed Evelyn's instructions, chanting the incantations she provided. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows writhed as if in pain. The figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness. Just as I thought it was over, a chilling voice cut through the air. "You cannot free them," it hissed. "They are mine." The voice sent a jolt of terror through me, freezing me in place. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence, and the temperature plummeted. The candles flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent glee. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. "Evelyn?" I called out, my voice trembling. The child's ghostly form reappeared, but now she seemed afraid, her eyes wide with terror. "He is the one who trapped us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He won't let us go." "Who is he?" I demanded, but Evelyn's form began to waver, her image growing faint. Before she could answer, the dark entity materialized in front of me. It was a tall, shadowy figure, its form constantly shifting and undulating as if made of smoke. Its eyes glowed with an intense, malevolent light. The room seemed to pulse with its presence, a tangible wave of dread washing over me. "You have no power here," the entity growled, its voice a guttural rasp. "Leave, or suffer the consequences." My heart pounded in my chest, but I stood my ground. "I won't leave until I free them," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What do you want?" The entity's eyes narrowed, and a sinister smile spread across its face. "You cannot free them," it hissed. "They belong to me, and soon, so will you." I felt a cold, invisible hand wrap around my throat, cutting off my air. I gasped, clawing at the unseen force, but it was no use. The entity's grip tightened, and black spots danced in my vision. Just as I thought I would pass out, the pressure suddenly released, and I collapsed to the floor, coughing and wheezing. "Leave this place," the entity commanded, its voice echoing in my ears. "Or face my wrath." Desperate for answers, I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the book of incantations. Flipping through the pages, I searched for something, anything that could help. My eyes landed on a spell of banishment, a complex ritual designed to expel malevolent spirits. It was risky, and I had no guarantee it would work, but it was my only hope. I began to chant the words, my voice shaky but growing stronger with each verse. The air crackled with energy, and the entity let out a furious roar. "You dare defy me," it bellowed, but I continued the incantation, my determination unwavering. The shadows around me seemed to writhe and convulse, the entity's form flickering as it fought against the spell. I could feel its anger, a searing heat that threatened to overwhelm me, but I pressed on. The room vibrated with an otherworldly force, the walls themselves seeming to warp and twist under the strain. "Release them," I shouted, pouring all my strength into the final words of the spell. The entity let out a deafening scream, a sound of pure rage and agony. Its form shattered into 1,000 pieces, dissolving into the darkness. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting from my shoulders. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but victorious. As I lay there, catching my breath, I saw Evelyn and her family standing before me, their forms shimmering with a soft, ethereal light. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "You have freed us." I smiled weakly, relief washing over me. "You're welcome," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Rest in peace." As the spirits began to fade, a sudden realization hit me. The house was still. Too still. The silence was unnatural, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. A cold dread settled over me as I sensed another presence, something even darker lurking in the shadows. Just as I began to rise, the whispering returned, louder and more menacing than before. The air grew cold once more, and I felt a familiar touch, cold fingers stroking my hair. My heart sank as I realized the dark entity was not gone. It had merely been waiting. The touch of those cold fingers sent a wave of dread through me. I realized that the entity was still there, lurking, watching. The room, once filled with an oppressive presence, now felt even more sinister, as if the entity had absorbed the darkness left by the spirits I had freed. I had to finish this, to banish the entity for good. My life depended on it. Gathering my courage, I stood up, the weight of exhaustion pulling at me. The entity's whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the room like a chilling chant. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "You belong to me now." Ignoring its taunts, I grabbed the book of incantations, desperately searching for something stronger, more definitive. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages, the whispers growing louder, more chaotic. I found a spell of ultimate banishment, a last resort. It required a great sacrifice, but it was the only way. With trembling hands, I began the incantation. The air around me thickened, crackling with dark energy. The entity's form coalesced in front of me, its eyes blazing with fury. "You dare challenge me again?" it roared, its voice a cacophony of anger and hatred. I continued the chant, my voice steady despite the fear gripping my heart. The shadows around the entity began to writhe, reacting to the power of the spell. "Leave this place," I commanded, my voice rising above the din. "Return to the darkness from whence you came." The entity's form flickered, its eyes narrowing with malice. It lunged at me, its shadowy tendrils reaching out to ensnare me. I felt a sharp, icy pain as they wrapped around my body, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My life depended on finishing the spell. The room shook, the walls groaning under the strain of the ritual. The entity let out a scream, a sound so inhuman it pierced my very soul. The shadows around it began to dissolve, its form growing weaker, more transparent. I pushed through the pain, chanting the final words of the incantation with all the strength I could muster. A blinding light filled the room, and the entity let out one final, ear-splitting scream. Its form shattered, the shadows dissipating into the ether. The air cleared, and an eerie silence settled over the house. I collapsed to the floor, the exhaustion overwhelming me. For a moment, I lay there, listening to the quiet. The oppressive presence was gone, the whispers silenced. I had done it. I had banished the dark entity. But as relief washed over me, a new fear took hold. The final words of the spell echoed in my mind, a great sacrifice. I looked around, expecting something terrible to happen, but the house remained still. Then I felt it, a searing pain in my chest. I gasped, clutching at my heart as it felt like it was being ripped apart. The sacrifice. It was my life. The entity had taken its due. Darkness closed in around me as I lay on the cold floor. My vision blurred, the edges of the room fading away. The pain intensified, a fiery agony that consumed me. I realized with a sickening dread that I had traded my life to save the spirits and banish the entity. As the world dimmed, I heard a familiar whisper. "Thank you," Evelyn's voice echoed softly. "We are free because of you." Her words brought a small measure of peace, even as the darkness swallowed me whole. In my final moments, I felt a strange calm. I had faced the darkness and won, even if it cost me everything. The house was finally at peace. And as my consciousness faded, I knew that my sacrifice had not been in vain. The last thing I saw was a faint, ethereal light, like the dawn breaking through the night. Then, everything went black. Story 6. The Haunting Frame. It was an ordinary day when I decided to hike up to the old woods behind my childhood home. The forest, dense and ancient, held a certain charm that always drew me in. I packed my camera, hoping to capture the serene beauty of nature. Little did I know that one photograph would change everything. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of leaves above. The air was cool and damp, the ground soft under my boots. I felt an odd sense of peace, mixed with an unsettling silence that seemed to swallow every step I took. Finally, I reached a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a stunning view of the valley below. I raised my camera and clicked. Reviewing the photos later that night, I felt a chill run down my spine. There, in the corner of one of the pictures, was a figure standing behind me. It was faint, almost ethereal, and definitely not there when I took the shot. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I showed the photo to my best friend, Mark, the next day. "Do you see this?" I asked, pointing at the ghostly figure. His face paled as he examined the picture. "That's really creepy," he said, his voice shaky. "Are you sure you were alone?" "I swear I was," I replied, my heart pounding. There was no one else there. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air in my room felt heavy, oppressive. Shadows danced on the walls, twisted into shapes that seemed to mock me. Sleep was elusive, my mind racing with thoughts of the figure in the photograph. Who was it? What did it want? The next morning, I decided to go back to the clearing. I needed answers. Mark, reluctantly, agreed to join me. We retraced my steps, the forest seeming more sinister in the daylight. As we approached the clearing, I felt a cold breeze brush against my skin, despite the warm summer sun. There, in the same spot, I took another photo. This time, the figure was clearer, more defined. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. She was dressed in tattered clothes, her expression one of sorrow and longing. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, looking over my shoulder. "We need to get out of here." But I couldn't leave. "Not yet." "Wait," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to understand who she is." We spent hours in the clearing, searching for clues. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground, we found it, a small, weathered gravestone, hidden beneath a tangle of roots and moss. The name on the stone was barely legible, but the date was clear, 1876. A chill ran through me as I realized we had disturbed something ancient, something restless. The figure in the photograph was more than just a ghost. She was a memory, a lingering fragment of a past long forgotten. And now, she had made herself known to us. The days that followed our discovery were filled with unease. My nights were restless, plagued by dreams of the ghostly figure. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her hollow eyes staring back at me, her lips moving silently, as if trying to communicate something important. Mark tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. We decided to visit the local library, hoping to unearth some information about the woman whose grave we had found. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, was eager to help. "Many families have lived in this area for generations," she said, leading us to the archives. "You might find what you're looking for in the old records." We spent hours poring over dusty ledgers and faded photographs. Finally, we found her, Eleanor Worthington, born in 1845, died in 1876. The brief note next to her name read, "Tragic end." I felt a shiver run down my spine. What had happened to her? Why was she haunting the woods? "Look at this," Mark said, pointing to an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Young woman disappears under mysterious circumstances." The article described how Eleanor had vanished one night, only to be found dead in the woods days later. No one knew what had happened to her, and her death remained a mystery. As we left the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was reaching out to us for a reason. "We need to go back," I said to Mark. "There has to be more to this." Reluctantly, he agreed. We returned to the clearing, the air thick with tension. The gravestone seemed even more weathered, as if eroding with each passing day. I took another photo, hoping to capture something that might give us a clue. This time, Eleanor's figure was clearer than ever, her hand outstretched, pointing towards the trees. We followed the direction she indicated, pushing through the dense underbrush. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin, hidden from view by the forest. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt alive. As we stepped inside, the air grew colder. Dust covered every surface, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. In the center of the room was an old, ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked. I felt an inexplicable urge to look into it. The moment my reflection came into view, I saw her standing behind me, clearer than ever. Her lips moved, and this time, I could hear her faint whisper, "Help me." Mark and I exchanged a glance, both of us understanding the gravity of the situation. We were not just dealing with a ghost, we were dealing with a soul trapped in torment. "What do you want?" I asked aloud, my voice trembling. The cabin seemed to respond, the air growing colder, more oppressive. The mirror fogged up, and letters began to appear as if written by an invisible hand. "Find him." "Find who?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. But the answer was clear. Someone had wronged Eleanor, and her spirit would not rest until justice was served. Our discovery in the cabin left us with more questions than answers. The foggy message in the mirror haunted my thoughts. Who was him, and how could we find him after all these years? Eleanor's spirit was restless, and we were the ones she had chosen to set things right. Back at the library, we delved deeper into the town's history. We found more about Eleanor. She had been engaged to a man named Charles Prescott, a wealthy landowner known for his temper. There were whispers and rumors that their relationship had been tumultuous, marked by jealousy and control. Charles had disappeared shortly after Eleanor's death, leaving no trace. "It has to be him," Mark said, pointing at an old photograph of Charles. His stern face and piercing eyes sent chills down my spine. But how do we find someone who's been missing for over a century? I didn't have an answer, but I knew we had to try. The next step was to find any remaining descendants of Charles Prescott. Our search led us to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The current resident, an elderly man named Henry Prescott, was Charles's great-grandson. He greeted us with suspicion but agreed to talk when we explained our purpose. "My great-grandfather was a troubled man," Henry admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of old secrets. "There were always whispers about what happened to Eleanor, but no one ever had proof. Some say he was involved in dark rituals, trying to gain power at any cost." My heart raced. "Do you have anything of his? Something that might help us understand what happened?" Henry hesitated before leading us to an old chest in the attic. Inside were faded letters, a tarnished locket, and an old journal. The journal's pages were filled with cryptic notes about rituals and summoning spirits. One entry, dated just days before Eleanor's death, caught my eye. "The ritual must be completed. Her soul will grant me power beyond imagination." We read on, horrified. Charles had indeed performed a dark ritual, sacrificing Eleanor to bind her spirit for his own gain. But something had gone wrong, and her spirit remained trapped, haunting the woods and the cabin. As we closed the journal, the temperature in the attic plummeted. I turned to see Eleanor's ghostly figure standing in the corner, her eyes filled with sorrow. She mouthed one word: "Destroy." "We have to end this," I said, my voice firm. "We need to destroy whatever he used to trap her." We gathered everything related to the ritual, Charles's journal, the locket, and some ritualistic tools, and made our way back to the cabin. The air was thick with tension, and the forest seemed to hold its breath as we approached. Inside the cabin, we placed the items in a circle and set them alight. The fire roared to life, and I felt a strange pull, as if something was being drawn out of the air. Eleanor's figure appeared once more, her face peaceful for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. But as the flames consumed the last remnants of the ritual, the ground began to tremble. The cabin shook, and an otherworldly scream filled the air. Mark and I stumbled outside, watching in horror as the cabin collapsed in on itself, swallowed by the earth. We stood in silence, the forest eerily calm. "Is it over?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. I hoped it was, but deep down, I feared we had only uncovered the surface of a much darker secret. Eleanor's spirit might be free, but something else had been awakened. The weeks following the cabin's collapse were eerily quiet. The forest seemed calmer, almost serene, and for a while, I believed that Eleanor's spirit had found peace. But the strange occurrences that began to plague my home soon shattered that illusion. It started with the mirror. One night, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of something moving behind me. Spinning around, I saw nothing out of place. But when I turned back to the mirror, there was a shadow, a dark figure lingering just out of focus. The same chilling presence I'd felt in the woods. The next few nights brought more disturbances, footsteps echoing through the house, doors creaking open on their own, and a cold breeze that seemed to follow me everywhere. Mark noticed the changes too. "It's like something's following you," he said one evening, worry etched on his face. "We need to figure out what's going on." We returned to Henry Prescott, hoping he might have more answers. When we told him about the disturbances, his face grew pale. "I feared this might happen," he said, his voice trembling. "The ritual your ancestor performed was powerful. By destroying the items, you might have released Eleanor, but something else was bound to them as well." "What do you mean?" I asked, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. Henry explained that Charles had tried to summon a powerful entity, something dark and ancient. The ritual went wrong, trapping Eleanor's spirit but also binding this entity to the land. By destroying the ritual items, we had released it. "You need to contain it," Henry urged, "before it gains strength." Desperation led us back to the woods. Armed with knowledge from Charles's journal, we gathered supplies for a new ritual, one to banish the entity. The clearing felt different now, as if the very air pulsed with malevolence. We set up the ritual circle, following the instructions meticulously. As night fell, the atmosphere grew oppressive, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. We began the ritual, chanting the incantations from the journal. The air grew colder, and the ground trembled. Suddenly, the figure from the photograph appeared, no longer just a shadow but a terrifying, tangible presence. Its form was grotesque, shifting and writhing as if made of smoke and darkness. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. "I am eternal." Fear threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to continue. "We have to finish the ritual," I shouted to Mark, who nodded, his face set in determination. Together, we chanted the final lines, the words burning with power. The entity screamed, a sound that echoed through the forest, rattling my very bones. The air around us shimmered, and the ground split open, drawing the entity towards it. With a final, deafening roar, it was sucked into the earth, the rift sealing shut behind it. Silence fell, the oppressive weight lifting. The forest was still, the night air crisp and clear. We collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. "Is it over?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. "I think so," I replied, though doubt lingered in my mind. The entity was gone, banished, but the scars it left behind were deep. Eleanor's spirit was free, but the darkness that had haunted the woods for so long had taken its toll. As we made our way back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that our victory was temporary. The photograph, the shadows, and the eerie occurrences had marked us. The forest held many secrets, and we had only scratched the surface. But for now, we had peace, and that was enough. Years later, I would still find myself drawn to that old photograph, a reminder of the darkness we had faced and the mysteries that lay hidden in the quiet corners of our world. The forest had returned to its serene beauty, but I knew, deep down, that it would never truly be the same. And neither would I. Story 7. The 13th Chime. The house stood on the outskirts of town, an ancient relic shrouded in ivy and shadow. I had inherited it from my great-uncle Tobias, a man I'd never met but whose reputation as an eccentric recluse was well known. The lawyer had been adamant that I take possession immediately, as if the house itself was eager for my arrival. When I first stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that pierced the gloom, and the creak of the floorboards seemed to echo the sighs of long-dead residents. The centerpiece of the living room was an imposing grandfather clock, its face frozen at 11:59, a relic of a bygone era. My fingers brushed against its polished wood, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Why don't you just sell it?" my friend Lisa had asked when I told her about the inheritance. "Old houses like that are more trouble than they're worth." But something about the house called to me, a whisper at the edge of my consciousness that refused to be ignored. I had always been drawn to the past, fascinated by the stories buried in old walls and forgotten artifacts. And so, despite Lisa's warnings, I moved in. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the mundane tasks of cleaning and organizing. I spent hours exploring every nook and cranny, uncovering hidden rooms and secret passageways. The house seemed to welcome me, its creaks and groans becoming a familiar, almost comforting presence. Yet, the clock in the living room remained silent, its hands stubbornly refusing to move. One night, as I sat reading by the fire, the silence was shattered by a sudden, sharp chime. My head snapped up, heart pounding as I stared at the grandfather clock. It was midnight, and the clock had come to life, its chime echoing through the house. I counted each strike, a cold dread settling over me as the chimes continued past 12. 13 times the clock struck, and with each chime, a whispering voice joined the chorus, unintelligible but undeniably present. I stood, my book forgotten as I approached the clock. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a chilling murmur that seemed to seep into my bones. I could make out fragments of sentences, disjointed words that hinted at something sinister. "Help us, trapped, beware," they said, and my blood ran cold. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the continued whispering that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I backed away, fear gripping my heart as the whispers faded, leaving me in a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, the result of an overactive imagination and too many ghost stories. But as the days passed, the chimes and whispers continued, each night growing louder and more insistent. I began to dread the approach of midnight, my nerves fraying under the relentless onslaught of the supernatural. One evening, as I stood before the clock, I noticed something I had missed before. An inscription, barely visible beneath layers of grime, etched into the wood. I scraped away the dirt, revealing a series of words that sent a chill down my spine. "Time is the key. 13 unlocks the door. Hey, subscribe for more scary stories." The cryptic inscription haunted my thoughts as I went about my daily routines. What door could the clock unlock? And why 13? The questions gnawed at me, filling my waking hours and creeping into my dreams. I knew I had to find answers, even if they led me down a path I feared to tread. One stormy night, as the wind howled outside and rain lashed against the windows, I decided to confront the mystery head-on. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I returned to the living room and stood before the clock. Midnight approached, the anticipation coiling in my stomach like a snake ready to strike. When the first chime rang out, I braced myself. As each subsequent chime echoed through the house, I counted them aloud, my voice trembling. 13 times the clock struck, and with each chime, the whispers grew louder, forming a chorus of desperate voices. I focused on the sound, trying to discern any clues in their murmurings. Then, on the 13th chime, I noticed something I had missed before. A faint outline of a door appeared on the wall beside the clock, as if the vibrations had loosened a hidden mechanism. I ran my hands over the wall, feeling for any irregularities. There it was, a small, almost imperceptible seam. My heart pounded as I pressed against it, and with a soft click, the hidden door swung open. Behind the door was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was cold and musty, carrying the scent of earth and decay. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but curiosity and a strange sense of duty pushed me forward. I descended the stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The staircase ended in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with dusty tomes and strange artifacts. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface tarnished with age. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, now emanating from the mirror itself. "Help us," the voices pleaded, clearer now but still fragmented. I stared into the mirror, my reflection distorted by the grime. Then, to my horror, the reflection began to change. Faces appeared, ghostly and pale, their eyes wide with terror. They pressed against the glass as if trapped within, their mouths moving in silent screams. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you want from me?" "We are the lost," one of the faces replied, its voice echoing in my mind. "Trapped by the clock, prisoners of time. You must free us." "How?" I asked, my heart racing. "What do I need to do?" "Unlock the 13th hour," the face said. "Find the key and set us free." The mirror fell silent, the faces fading back into the darkness. I stood there, shaken and confused. What key? Where was I supposed to find it? I turned to the shelves, hoping to find some clue among the ancient books and artifacts. My fingers brushed against a particularly old book, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The title, barely legible, read The Chronicles of the 13th Hour. I opened the book, my eyes scanning the yellowed pages. It was filled with arcane symbols and cryptic passages, but one thing stood out, a drawing of the grandfather clock, with the words "Key to the 13th Hour" inscribed beneath it. I knew then that the answer lay within the clock itself. I returned to the living room, the book clutched tightly in my hands. As I examined the clock more closely, I noticed a small keyhole hidden among the intricate carvings. My pulse quickened. This was it. I needed to find the key and unlock whatever secrets the 13th hour held. I spent the next few days scouring the house for the key, searching every drawer, every hidden nook and cranny. The whispers continued to haunt me, growing more desperate with each passing night. "Find the key," they urged. "Free us." My sleep was plagued by nightmares, my mind consumed by the quest. One rainy afternoon, I found myself in the attic, a place I had avoided since moving in. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung like tattered curtains from the rafters. I rummaged through old trunks and boxes, hoping for a sign, when I stumbled upon an ornate chest, unlike anything else in the attic. It was locked, but I remembered an old, rusted key I had found in Tobias's desk. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the chest's lock. It turned with a satisfying click, and I lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of curious objects, an old photograph, letters bound with twine, and a small, intricate key, unlike any I had seen before. My heart leapt. This had to be it. That night, as the clock approached midnight, I stood before the grandfather clock, the key clutched tightly in my hand. The room seemed to pulse with anticipation, the air heavy with the presence of unseen entities. As the clock began to chime, I counted each strike, my breath hitching with each one. On the 13th chime, I inserted the key into the hidden keyhole and turned it. The clock's face began to glow with an eerie light, and the hands started to move, spinning wildly. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of desperate pleas and chilling moans. The room around me seemed to warp and shift, and I felt a strange sensation, as if I were being pulled through time itself. Suddenly, the room went silent. The clock had stopped, and I found myself standing in an unfamiliar place. The house was the same, yet different, as if I had been transported to another time. The furnishings were old-fashioned, the air filled with the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood. "Welcome," a voice said behind me, and I turned to see a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt. "You have unlocked the 13th hour." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "My name is William," he replied. I, too, was trapped by the clock, bound by the curse of the 13th hour. "Curse?" I repeated, my heart pounding. "What curse?" "The clock was created by a sorcerer," William explained. "He sought to control time, to trap the souls of the unwary within its gears. We are the victims of his madness, condemned to relive our final moments over and over, until someone breaks the curse." "How can I break it?" I asked, desperate to understand. "You must destroy the clock," William said. "Only then will we be free. But beware, the sorcerer's power is great. He will not let us go easily. As he spoke, the room began to shift again, the familiar whispers rising once more. I was thrust back into the present, the clock still glowing with an unearthly light. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my hands shaking, and raised it above my head. With all my strength, I brought it down on the clock. The glass shattered, and the gears inside began to grind and scream. The whispers turned into agonized wails, filling the room with a deafening roar. But I didn't stop. I struck the clock again and again, until it was nothing more than a pile of broken wood and twisted metal. The wails ceased, replaced by a profound silence. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence lifted. I sank to the floor, exhausted but relieved. I had done it. I had broken the curse. Or so I thought. As I caught my breath, a new sound reached my ears, a slow, deliberate ticking. I looked up to see the remains of the clock beginning to reassemble themselves, the gears and pieces moving as if guided by an invisible hand. My relief turned to horror as I realized that the sorcerer's curse was far from broken. The clock's pieces moved with a life of their own, reassembling faster than I could comprehend. The air grew cold, and a deep sense of dread settled over me. Desperation clawed at my mind as I watched the cursed device come back together, each tick reverberating through my bones. I knew then that brute force alone would not be enough to defeat the sorcerer's dark magic. Think, I muttered to myself, pacing the room. The whispers had returned, softer now, almost soothing, as if urging me toward a solution. I remembered the book I had found in the hidden chamber, the Chronicles of the 13th Hour. Perhaps the answer lay within its pages. I raced back to the basement, my flashlight casting erratic beams across the walls. The room felt different this time, the atmosphere charged with a strange energy. I grabbed the book and flipped through its pages, scanning for any hint of how to truly break the curse. My eyes landed on a passage that described a ritual, a way to sever the sorcerer's bond with the clock. The instructions were detailed and precise, a circle of salt, specific incantations, and the use of a personal item from the sorcerer himself. I felt a glimmer of hope. If I could find something that belonged to the sorcerer, I might be able to perform the ritual and end this nightmare once and for all. I searched the room, pulling open drawers and examining every artifact. At the bottom of an old wooden box, I found a ring, ancient and ornate, with a dark gemstone that seemed to pulse with an inner light. This had to be it. Clutching the ring, I hurried back upstairs, ready to prepare for the ritual. The house groaned as if sensing my intentions, but I moved with purpose, drawing a circle of salt in the living room and placing the ring in the center. I began chanting the incantations from the book, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The clock's ticking grew louder, more frantic, as if it knew what I was trying to do. As I completed the final words, a powerful wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and sending papers flying. The temperature plummeted, and I felt a presence, dark and malevolent, materialize behind me. I turned to see a figure cloaked in shadows, eyes glowing with a sinister light. "You dare challenge me?" the sorcerer hissed, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You cannot break my curse. I am eternal." Summoning all my courage, I stood my ground. "Your time is over. You will not trap another soul." The sorcerer lunged at me, but as he crossed the salt circle, he recoiled, his form flickering. The ring in the center glowed brighter, and I continued chanting, louder and more forceful. The sorcerer screamed, a sound of pure agony, as his essence was drawn into the ring. The clock's ticking slowed, then stopped altogether, and the room was plunged into an eerie silence. I watched in awe as the ring absorbed the sorcerer's power, the gemstone darkening until it was a solid black. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound silence that felt almost sacred. I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but victorious. It was over. The curse was finally broken. I glanced at the grandfather clock, now just an empty shell, and felt a wave of relief. The house was quiet, peaceful, as if it had been cleansed of its dark past. Days passed, and I began to restore the house, removing the remnants of the sorcerer's influence. Life slowly returned to normal, the memories of the terrifying nights fading like a bad dream. But I kept the ring, a reminder of the ordeal I had survived, and the lives I had freed. One night, as I sat by the fire, I heard a soft chime. My heart skipped a beat as I looked up, but there was no clock, only the ring on the mantel, its gemstone glinting in the firelight. A faint whisper reached my ears, a final thank you from the souls I had set free. I smiled, finally at peace, knowing that the 13th chime would never haunt me again. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.